My name is Melissa, and I want to share an experience that may resonate with some of you. It all started when my cousin, Anthony, introduced me to Thomas, believing we'd be a perfect match. Thomas was charming, with an engaging and warm demeanor that made me feel at ease. We hit it off immediately, and after a year of dating, he proposed. I was over the moon, looking forward to the life we'd build together. Anthony frequently remarked that Thomas and I seemed like a match made in heaven, and our wedding was everything I dreamed of, beautiful, joyful, and full of love. Soon after the wedding, Thomas suggested we move in with his mother, Diana, to support her following the death of her husband and to save money. Initially, I hesitated, but Thomas's reasoning made sense, so I agreed. Living with Diana started off smoothly. She was kind, and we got along well. I did my best to help around the house, ensuring everything was comfortable for all of us. However, after 7 months of marriage, Thomas suggested I quit my job to focus more on household responsibilities and helping Diana. I loved my job as an accountant, so the suggestion made me uneasy, but after some persuasion, I agreed, believing it was for the best for our family. At first, I adjusted well. I threw myself into household chores, spending time with Diana and learning more about her family's traditions. Though I missed my work, I thought the sacrifice was worthwhile for family harmony. Thomas seemed happy, and things felt like they were going well, but soon, the dynamics began to shift. Diana's requests became more frequent and demanding, and Thomas's attitude toward me changed. I began to feel less like a partner and more like a servant. One morning, while preparing breakfast, Diana criticized the living room's cleanliness. Even though I had just cleaned it, she snapped at me, telling me to be more thorough. Later, she complained to Thomas, urging him to address my supposed negligence. I defended myself, but Thomas sided with his mother, telling me I needed to do better. Living with Diana and Thomas became an exhausting balancing act, with my every move scrutinized. Diana's harsh critiques and Thomas's disappointment hung over me constantly, making me feel as if I could never do enough. One day, Diana invited some friends over for lunch, giving me little time to prepare. She demanded that I make everything perfect. As I served the guests, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were judging me. One guest even commented, "Is this your daughter-in-law, Diana? She seems a bit overwhelmed." Diana didn't miss a beat, remarking that I needed to improve my household management skills. Afterward, she complained to Thomas, criticizing my cooking and disorganization. When he confronted me, his anger flared, and despite my defense, he dismissed my efforts, insisting I needed to do better. The atmosphere grew increasingly hostile. Diana's nitpicking escalated, and Thomas's temper became more unpredictable. I began to dread each day, bracing myself for the next round of criticism. One afternoon, while reading a book in the living room, Diana found me and coldly reminded me of the chores I still had to do. When Thomas came home, Diana quickly informed him of my brief break, portraying it as laziness. He exploded, telling me I couldn't afford to rest. By the time our daughter, Alice, was born 3 years into our marriage, I had hoped she would bring some peace into our home. She became my light in the midst of the chaos. I poured my energy into caring for her, trying to shield her from the storm. But as Alice grew, Thomas's anger grew as well. One evening, after a minor mess in the house, he exploded. "Why is this place such a mess?" he yelled. I explained I had been with Alice all day, but he was relentless, calling me useless and shoving me. I fell to the floor, crying out in pain, and Alice ran to my side, calling, "Mommy." Thomas, furious, ordered her to go to her room, but she froze, witnessing the scene. At that moment, everything became painfully clear. I realized that if things didn't change, the damage to Alice's emotional well-being could be irreversible. Her stutter, which had started that night, was a painful sign that our home's atmosphere was taking its toll on her. I couldn't bear the thought of her accepting this as normal, but leaving seemed impossible. Thomas had made it clear, if I ever left, he would take Alice from me. The fear of losing her kept me trapped in this nightmare. Then, one day, Anthony called with unexpected news. "Melissa, I have some bad news. Your mom passed away," he said, gently. I hadn't seen my mother in years. Thomas had forbidden me from contacting her, but I knew I needed to attend her funeral. I approached Thomas, hoping to maintain my composure. "Thomas, my mom passed away. I need to go to her funeral," I said, my voice trembling. Without looking up, he coldly dismissed me. "No, you're not going. We can't afford it, he said. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I pleaded with him, please, Thomas, she was my mom, I have to go. His response was final, no, stay here and take care of the house and Alice. Overcome with sadness and frustration, I felt a surge of determination. I knew I had to go, no matter what. That night, I quietly woke Alice. Sweetie, we're going on a little trip, stay quiet, okay? Okay, Mommy, she replied, confused. After making sure everyone was asleep, I packed a small bag for us, grabbed my savings, and quietly left the house. We drove to my hometown, arriving early the next morning, exhausted but relieved to be away from Thomas. Even for a short while, we stayed in a small motel before heading to the funeral. During the service, my phone rang. It was Thomas. I accidentally hit the speaker button, and his furious voice blasted through the room. Melissa, get your ass back home right now, or I swear to God, I'll file for divorce and take Alice from me, he yelled. The room fell silent as my relatives stared at me, shocked and sympathetic. The reality of my situation became clear to everyone. Embarrassed, I quickly ended the call, muttering, I'm at my mom's funeral, Thomas, we'll talk later, before hanging up. Afterward, Anthony approached me, his face full of concern. Melissa, you can't go back to that, you deserve better, he said, handing me a piece of paper with a lawyer's contact information. Call this lawyer, they can help. I held the paper, a mix of fear and hope stirring within me. Maybe this was my chance to change things. Thank you, Anthony, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. That night, as I lay awake in the motel, I felt a small spark of hope. For the first time in a long while, I felt empowered. I knew I had to make a change for both Alice and myself. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of resolve. I could no longer allow fear or Thomas's control to dominate my life. My mother had left me her house and a small amount of money, a lifeline, a chance to start over. With the lawyer's number in hand, I knew it was time to act. Taking a steadying breath, I dialed. Hello, Mr. Jerry, this is Melissa. I'd like to schedule a consultation, I said, my voice betraying the fear and determination within. Of course, Mrs. Melissa, can you come in this afternoon? He replied. Yes, I'll be there, I confirmed, my heart racing with a mix of hope and fear. After dropping Alice off with Anthony, I drove to the lawyer's office. Though anxiety churned in my stomach, I felt a strange sense of readiness. Mr. Jerry greeted me warmly. Mrs. Melissa, please, tell me everything, he urged, his tone calming. I recounted the years of control, threats, and violence, as he listened intently, taking notes. We need solid evidence of the abuse, both physical and emotional, he said. Start documenting everything, keep a detailed journal, and record incidents where you can. I will, I promised, I'll write down everything. After the meeting, I bought a new smartphone, a small but significant act of rebellion. I set it up with a secure passcode and tested its recording function. I needed to be ready for whatever came next. With newfound resolve, I returned to Anthony's to pick up Alice. She seemed happier and more relaxed, a comfort I hadn't seen in months. Ready to go home, sweetie? I asked, hugging her tightly. Yes, Mommy, she answered, a smile lighting up her face. As we headed back to Thomas and Diana's house, a quiet determination settled in me. I knew what awaited, hostility and tension, but this time, I wasn't empty-handed. This time, I was prepared to stand my ground. When I stepped through the door, Diana was waiting, her face twisted with disapproval. Where the hell have you been, Melissa? Do you think you can just come and go as you please? She snapped. I was at my mother's funeral, Diana, I answered calmly. Well, you're back now, get to work, this house won't clean itself, she huffed, dismissing me without a second thought. I took a deep breath and discreetly turned on my new phone, slipping it into my pocket. I had a plan now, and I was going to stick to it, document everything. As I carried out my chores, I recorded every harsh word and hostile act, building my evidence, one incident at a time. Later that day, Thomas came home, his fury radiating. Melissa, what the hell were you thinking, leaving like that without my permission? He shouted. I went to my mom's funeral, Thomas, I had to go, I replied, my pulse quickening. You don't do anything without my say-so, you hear me? He yelled, his face red with anger. Give me your phone and purse. I handed him my old phone, thankful for the precaution I had taken. His attempts to intimidate me weren't working anymore. I had already started gathering the evidence I needed. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat with my journal, writing down every insult, every threat, every degrading word. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of purpose, a clarity that had been absent for far too long. The days that followed were difficult. Thomas and Diana's hostility didn't let up, but I continued to record and document every encounter, building my case, preparing for the fight ahead. One evening during dinner, Diana began her usual tirade. Leaving the house without Thomas's permission? You're a disgrace, she sneered. Diana, don't insult me in front of my daughter, I said firmly, keeping my voice calm. Thomas's face flushed with anger. How dare you raise your voice at my mother? He roared, shoving me roughly. I stumbled but regained my balance. Then he raised his hand, his eyes filled with fury. You live here on borrowed rights, Melissa, don't forget that, he shouted. I took a deep breath, and, with an unexpected calm, I said, I want a divorce, Thomas. His face went redder, and he screamed, You belong to me, you'll be my property until death. This time, I wasn't afraid. My phone was still in my pocket, recording every word. For the first time, I felt a sense of control. Over the next week, I kept recording every insult and threat from both Thomas and Diana. Their cruelty was unrelenting, but I stayed strong, quietly documenting their every move. Diana's insults were constant. You're worthless, Melissa, you can't even keep a house clean, she spat. And Thomas was no better. You think you're tough now? You can never leave me, you're nothing without me, he raged. But I kept my cool. With every shout, every put down, I recorded, writing it down later in my journal. It was exhausting, but necessary. One day, while preparing dinner, Diana went off again. You're a disgrace to this family, Melissa, leaving like that, she spat. I discreetly recorded her words, feeling my resolve strengthen. With every cruel comment, my determination grew. I was collecting the pieces of my future, one step at a time. The days after my mother's funeral were some of the hardest, but they also gave me the clarity I needed. With a sense of purpose, I reached out to Mr. Jerry. Mr. Jerry, it's Melissa, I've got everything, it's unbearable here, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside. Melissa, your cousin hired a private investigator to look into your husband. The results are alarming. Can you meet with him today? Mr. Jerry replied. Yes, I'll be there, I said, my heart racing with anticipation. When I met the private investigator, he handed me a folder with damning information. Melissa, your husband is involved in fraudulent schemes and has ties to criminal activity. The police have been monitoring him, but they didn't have enough evidence until now, he explained. I took the folder, feeling the weight of it in my hands. Thank you, I whispered, overwhelmed by the implications. I drove home, but when I pulled into the driveway, Thomas was waiting, his face twisted with fury. Where the hell have you been, Melissa? Get inside now, he yelled. Fear rose in my chest, but I stayed calm. I quickly called Anthony. Thomas is furious. I have the evidence. Can you call the police? I asked, my voice trembling. Stay in the car, Melissa, I'll handle it, Anthony replied. Just then, Thomas yanked the car door open and pulled me out, dragging me toward the house. You don't listen, think you can defy me? He screamed. But before he could drag me inside, the police arrived, lights flashing. I collapsed to the pavement, overwhelmed by everything. The officers quickly intervened, arresting Thomas, and taking the folder of evidence with them. As Thomas was led away, Diana stormed out, her face livid. You ungrateful woman, we took you in, and this is how you repay us, she spat. I remained silent, knowing there was nothing left to say. I packed our things, with Alice clinging to my side, and left the house behind. I rented a small apartment, a modest place, but one that felt like a haven compared to what we had escaped. As the trial date neared, Mr. Jerry worked tirelessly, preparing our case. He was confident that with the evidence we had, the recordings, the journal, and the investigators' findings, we would win. On the day of the trial, I entered the courtroom, a mixture of fear and hope in my chest. I held my head high, ready to fight for Alice and my future. Mr. Jerry presented the evidence clearly, and it was overwhelming. Reliving the pain was hard, but it was necessary for our freedom. When the judge spoke, I held my breath. Based on the evidence presented, I grant the divorce and full custody of the child to Mrs. Melissa. The defendant is also ordered to pay financial compensation for damages and alimony for life. Thomas's inability to pay meant he would have to sell his house. He was also sentenced to 6 years in prison for his criminal activities and the abuse he had inflicted. At home, I sat with Alice, explaining everything in simple terms. "Are we safe now, Mommy?" she asked, hope in her eyes. "Yes, Alice, we're safe, we're free to live our lives the way we want," I replied, tears of relief streaming down my face. We moved back to my mother's house, and for the first time in years, I felt peace. With Anthony's help, I secured a job at a local charity that supported women in difficult situations, and Alice blossomed. Her stutter disappeared, and she became more confident and happy. 6 years later, I received an unexpected call. "It's Thomas, I want to see my daughter," he demanded, his voice harsh. Anger flared within me, but I stood firm. "No, Thomas, you lost that right, don't bother us again," I said, ending the call before he could say more. Looking at Alice, playing in the yard, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. We had come so far, and I would protect this life with everything I had. I raised Alice to be strong and independent, to always know her worth and never let anyone belittle or control her. This was our new chapter, one of freedom, empowerment, and love.